Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum. This video is about two competing strains within the Abrahamic traditions. One of these strains, common to each of the Abrahamic traditions, predates the canon of the Bible, as we know it, the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. The other one of these strains stems directly from it. The excerpt that we're going to see, and I'll pause a few times through it, through the video, to discuss, is from the Bible Unearthed, The Making of a Religion. The first of these strains is really common to every religious tradition in the world, and that is the strain of authority being rooted in and passed down from family to family, from parent to child, from teacher to student, and so on and so forth. And this occurred in a way that the tradition passed down evolved in some cases, in other cases sort of became deconstructed and reassembled through different influences of what was going on in the given society at the time, and influences, outside influences. This first strain that I'm referring to does not root itself in a textual, scriptural source, but roots itself in a tradition that is always assumed to have been. Woody Allen once said that tradition is the illusion of permanence. And this is precisely what this first strain is about, the illusion of permanence. It purports that the tradition was the way that it is today, that it always was the same, and that thousands of years from now it will be maintained, if it goes by the same name, that it will be maintained in the same form as it currently is, and that it always was, always will be, etc. The second strain, which is what this video excerpt is about rooting authority in a scriptural source, in a scriptural criterion that everybody agrees to, everybody within the tradition, and that authority for a statement can be derived from direct citation thereof, or from extrapolation of passages cited therein. So, without further ado,
the Bible sets out Josiah's declaration to the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. We will now turn to one element of the story, which is based on a book.
The fact that they said a book had been found, which means that it was an ancient book that was lost somewhere in the temple, obviously legitimated the reform. But at the same time, it also shows that the redefinition of the Judaic religion was now going to be based on a book. The book was going to become the basis of a new religion. So it's not just the fact that a book was found, but there's the whole issue of the status and importance of that book, which it didn't have before.
In order to pursue our investigation, we have to examine a central question, that of writing. What do we know about the beginnings of writing in this region? In which circumstances did writing become important in the society of ancient Israel? Did the Israelites know how to read and write in the 7th century BC? Here again, we have to look to archaeology for the answers. In the 7th century sites, we have discovered many seals and ostraka, fragments of pottery that contain inscriptions. In the 8th century, they are very rare. Before that, they are quite simply non-existent. These brief texts deal with economic or administrative questions. Written by scribes, they provide evidence of the development and centralization of Judah, which was then an Assyrian vassal. This corresponds to a well-known phenomenon. The emergence of a state is generally accompanied by the spread of writing. In an ostracon of the 7th century, a laborer complains to the authorities about the theft of a garment. In what way does this text provide proof of a revolution?
Before the 7th century BC, it's clear that the ancient Israelites were not literate. As a matter of fact, what we would say is that literacy wasn't even a category that people thought about. It wasn't an important idea in society. Beginning in the 7th century, writing spreads through all classes of Israelite society. We see writing by tomb cutters, by officers in the army, by workmen. Variety of different kinds of people throughout society are writing and apparently reading as well. And the spread of writing in ancient Israel at this time indicates that writing at least had a beginnings of literacy in Israel. And of course, this beginnings of literacy will be critical to the emergence of a sacred, written, and authoritative text.
Writing had just expanded beyond the circle of scribes. Of course, public readings of the book discovered in the temple do not prove the degree of literacy of the population of Judah. But they do show the function that the written word had attained in 7th century society. In the small state of Judah, under the reign of Josiah, a revolution had been launched.
The fact that a sacred written text emerged from a pastoral agrarian society is a watershed of Western civilization. Never before in human history had societies had sacred texts that were authoritative. Most Near Eastern civilizations had texts only for governments, for writing. Authority, cultural authority, religious authority was passed from family to family through oral tradition. It wasn't passed by reading texts or appealing to the authority of text. The first time in human history that we have the authority of human text is with the Josianic religious reforms, where they appeal to the authority of a written text and have that written text as a binding authority for the entire culture, for all people, as opposed to the authority of the family and the tradition. And this is a watershed of Western civilization.
In the 7th century.
Okay, so what does this tell us? Within Islamic tradition, Jews in particular are known as Ahl Kitab. So the Ahl Kitab are known as the people of the book. The Quran also uses a parallel term for Christians, even though there's some overlap where Ahl Kitab is used for Nazarenes as well. But Nazarenes and Christians are also referred to as Al-Injil, or people of the Gospel. Now, there are instances where the community of Muhammad are referred to in the Quran as also seemingly being the Ahl Kitab, the people of the book. But whether this was more a result of Quranic influence or predating it, the term has stuck, and the Jewish people have become known as people of the book, a term which has been embraced. Now, as we can see here, this was, as one of the scholars said, a watershed event. This this authority of the Bible emerging with these religious reforms, but really with these religious evolutions. Now, the Quran itself refers to the book, Al-Kitab. Al-Kitab is an ambiguous term because sometimes it seems, particularly in light of later tafsir, that the Quran is referring to itself when it speaks of the book, but at other times it seems clearly to be referring to the Torah. Now, we can resort to later exegesis or a tafsir to quote-unquote elucidate this, and we can say that this refers to the al-Kitab, the sort of primordial heavenly book. But really, for our purposes, what we would want to do is find evidence within the Quran itself that this is the case. And there are references to such a primordial book within the Quran, but there are times when it seems to be referring to itself as a book, and times when perhaps it's introducing the recitation of a book. And we have to remember that the Quran itself was delivered sermonically, amidst or during or as the conclusion of khutbat, sermons from Muhammad. And we also have to remember that a lot of that context that we have, we just don't know unless we're going to resort to later traditions to tell us what may or may not be the case. So what we have to consider then is that when the Quran talks about Al-Kitab, it talks about the community of Muhammad being given Al-Kitab, and it also talks about the Criterion, or Furqan. The Furqan is basically what's being described by these scholars here. It's the notion of referring and deferring to a scriptural criterion for authority and for authenticating what one is saying. So, far from referring to Karaitism in Judaism's, this would also apply to the Talmud, which the Quran cites over and over and over, and also calls the Kitab. Why? Because in Jewish tradition, the Talmud, the Mishnah, and Gemara are referred to as the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is not simply, well, we heard this, this was passed down, so and so. It's not simply that. What it is it's saying we can tell from this passage of the Torah that because this is said and that is said, that the implication is this, or that. So, as a quick example, we see in Bereshit that Abraham is said to have been buried by both Isaac and Ishmael. Now, we were told that Ishmael went off with his mother. Now, the authors of this weren't, as many modern critical scholars would presume, idiots. They weren't just hodgepodge, pasting things together and unaware of the priestly source and the Yahweh source and the Elohist source and so on and so forth. While one could make that case and could argue the documentary hypothesis, what one can't really argue is that the people putting this together were so stupid that they didn't notice certain things, certain glaring, apparent inconsistencies between chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Genesis or Bereshit, or that one wouldn't notice that they had just written Ishmael off and then all of a sudden he's back burying his father with his long-lost estranged brother. These are things that were very deliberately put into the story to allude to hidden stories or midrashic stories. Now, this doesn't mean that they were put in by the hand of God. One person may believe that. Another person can believe that the redactor who put all these things together deliberately wrote those in. But what I think you do have to accept is that somebody deliberately wrote the stories that way, whether it was coming from the mind of the universe through the particular prophet, Moshe Rabbeinu, or whether it was coming from various tribal interpretations of the Torah given, by an individual that we call Moshe today, or Moses. That these traditions became changed and, then eventually were put back into one form by a redactor, presumably Ezra. You can argue either one of those things, but what you do have to argue, really, if you look critically at the Hebrew text, not just the translations, is that this stuff's going on very deliberately. It's not an accident. And if you notice something, it's not, hey, I got you, you screwed up. Ezra, the scribe, or the redactor, are. You're supposed to notice that something's off. It happens so often, and it happens in such blatant ways that it's inconceivable that this wouldn't have been pointed out right from the start, and that it wouldn't have been quote-unquote corrected over the years if it was seen as an error. So, Talmudically, the stories, when we see these midrashic stories, Ishmael must have gone back, and here's what happened, and here's how he and his brother got along well, and here's why the phrasing, as Rashi says, of the death of Ishmael shows in the Hebrew that he died a tzaddik, and so on and so forth. The point is that the Talmud itself, it derives its authority from citing the Torah itself, from citing the Tanakh itself. So it's not simply saying this is just the way it is. We do this because that's just the way that people do it, or it's the way that my father did it, and so on and so forth. This is, however, the way that most religion passes itself down, and it is the way that most religion, in fact, discerns and assumes authority. So this is something unique to the Abrahamic tradition in some sense, because beginning with this point, as we've just seen described, we see the Kitab, we see the Bible itself being referred to as the Criterion, the Furqan, and really ever since in Jewish tradition, and even in Christianity, which emerged from the milieu of Second Temple Jewish sectarianism and the Theosebes God-fearer movement that was co-opted, or some might say hijacked, by Paul, the founder of Christianity. Really, we see the same thing there, too, where people will say, well, Jesus said X, Y, or Z, but then they really have to go to Paul to get the Christian theology. So then they say, well, Paul writes in his epistle to fill in the blank, such and such. So still the concept's, still there. We see it as well with Muhammad's community, even, far after him, as Islam takes shape as a separate tradition. We see people say, well, the Quran says such and such. But there's always been a remnant preserved fighting against that notion of scriptural criteria that has been trying to reassert itself and trying to outdo the scriptural source, vying for dominance. And that is that same trend that we find within every religious tradition, that so-and-so heard from so-and-so that, such and such. Even if that contradicts the scriptural authority or Furqan, this has happened to a great extent within Christianity and within Islam, so-called. Or should we say within the Muslim world, perhaps. It's happened in some ways in strains of Judaism. There are a number of things that we can point to where this community or that community has examples of this. But by and large, Judaism has been characterized by deferment to the Torah. So in Christianity, we have people having all these beliefs that not only don't trace to their recorded words of Jesus, but they actually contradict recorded words of Jesus canonized by the Council of Nicaea in the Christian canon, in the Christian Testament that they call the New Testament. So the same thing in the Muslim world. There are many beliefs, many folk beliefs, many traditional beliefs, the Sirah genre and the Hadith genre that sometimes not only aren't found in the Quran, but contradict very clearly stated things, as the Quran says of itself, that it is stated unambiguously, that it is the Kitab al-Mubin, that it is the clear and unambiguous book stated in clear Arabic dialect, which was a regional dialect of Aramaic, as was Nabatean and Mandaic and Syriac, Palestinian Aramaic. There were many Aramaics at the time. We know this not by the name Aramaic, which many forms of Aramaic didn't call themselves, but by the rules and by the cognates and the various linguistic details. So it says in itself, it says that it is a clearly stated, unambiguous book. So we don't really need for somebody to clarify that the Quran really meant something completely opposite. We don't need for someone to come along about 200 years later and say, well, the Quran really means that the Torah was corrupted and that Ishmael was being sacrificed, even though the Quran was talking about Yitzhak or Ishaq, and then refers to Abraham's son and never says Ishmael, and just before that it was talking about Ishaq. So we would assume that it meant that the biblical story was correct, a story which was confirmed in the letter of James, the brother of Jesus. And for 200 years or so, nobody disputes that story. The great Sufi Ibn Arabi says the same thing. It was Isaac or Yitzhak. And so the point is, these traditions that are contrary to what the Quran says about itself in clear, unambiguous terms, is not anything new. It's not anything particularly novel. It's something characteristic of religion itself. It's how religion tends to be perpetuated, and it is simply reasserted in the Islamic tradition in spite of, in contrast to, in opposition to the Quran itself as a scriptural authority. And as a scriptural authority, it doesn't mean in competition to the Torah, which it affirms over and over and over, and tells people to consult and tells people not to ask Muhammad something if it's already stated in the Torah, but as a midrash itself. This is how the Quran acts, as a socio-religious midrash, like many midrashim before it and many midrashim after it. A particularly socially useful midrash that reformed Arabian society, and that may have in fact fulfilled a prophecy of the Talmud itself, which it quotes from over and over, as I said, but from the tractate Avodah Zarah, where it talks about all the tribes of Kedar. This is another issue for another day, however. So I leave you with that thought. Shalom Aleichem, Assalamu Alaikum.